Hi, my name is Andrew Feinstein. I'm Executive Director of Shadow World Investigations in London. I'm an investigative author, a filmmaker, a campaigner, and perhaps most importantly, a father. Today on the show, Dov and I explore the leadership of Nelson Mandela, the corrupt, deadly global trade in weapons, criticizing Israel and its brutal occupation of the Palestinian territories as a Jew, and conspiracy theories.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. Let me ask you, what do you need to do to up-level your leadership? Well, the simple answer could be awaken. Now, I'm not talking about being woke. We're talking about paying attention to what's really going on under your nose and is normalized by oftentimes corporate media and also often, hate to say this, but you got to wake up to it, corrupted government bodies. Now, I'm not talking, this is not a tinfoil hat moment. This is not conspiracy, but rather as a leader, asking yourself, what are you willing to do about what shows up that you normally brush to the side? Nothing? You can do that, of course. Or will you add your voice to the silenced majority for the sake of your children, your grandchildren, and maybe the future of humanity? Well, stay tuned, because that's where we're going on today's show. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. If you're curious to know more, you can simply go to dovbaron.com. This episode of Leadership and Loyalty is brought to you in part by our other podcast, Curiosity Bites. Curiosity Bites is the answer to the question, how can we bring people together who completely disagree? This is exactly what your heart, your mind, your soul has been craving. It's your chance to sit in on some real and oftentimes intense conversations with some of the world's most interesting people. We're talking about political scientists, we're talking about astronauts, neuroscientists, philosophers, holy people, quantum physicists, skeptics, entrepreneurs, multi-award-winning Grammy entertainers. These are some fascinating individuals, some of whom you think you would completely disagree with, that you'll be blown away by. Simply go to dovbaron.com, that's dovbaron.com, and find out how you can sign up for and sink your teeth into the delicious Curiosity Bites. As always, you can find both of these podcasts, the Leadership and Loyalty and Curiosity Bites, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you tune into podcasts. And we always need your help in staying relevant, so please get over there, rate, review, and subscribe. And do us a favor, share the show with everybody you know. Oh, by the way, we also want to say a big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. And we're honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. Anyone with any level of awakening knows that much as we might want to believe differently, the truth is corruption is rife. The question becomes, when we see corruption, do we have the moral fiber, the fortitude to stand up and be counted? Some of my Christian friends will ask themselves, well, what would Jesus do? Other of my friends will say, well, what would the Buddha do? Well, what about if you admired the man, what would Nelson Mandela do? If you admired Mandela, maybe that's a good question. When you think about what he went through and how he came out, let's find out together, because our guest today is the esteemed Andrew Feinstein. Now, Andrew is a former ANC MP. Remember them? They're the people who took power when Mandela came in. He served under Nelson Mandela. He is an author, a filmmaker who investigates the corruption of deadly global arms trade. He's an independent contributor to the self-sufficient journalistic platform Double Down News, one of my favorites. He is the author of The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade, which has been made into an award-winning feature documentary. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me welcome Andrew Feinstein. Good to have you here, Andrew. Thank you for joining us, mate.
Great to be with you, Gav.
We're really looking forward to it. Now, the first question I always like to ask my guests is, in the context of leadership development, what is the question that we should be looking for the answer to, but we're not? We're just, not paying attention to this. We're ignorant of it.
What has happened to our ethics? What has happened to our values? That, for me, is the key question of our age. And the question, in my opinion, straddles the private sector, it straddles the public sector, it straddles the third sector, the non-governmental sector, because I think we are at an all-time low in terms of ethics and values. And Dov, this might be a consequence of the fact that I spend every day investigating, researching, writing about, making films about the global arms trade, which accounts for 40% of all corruption in all world trade. So I see at first hand just how corrupted our governments, our political institutions have become. And unfortunately, how corporations, consultancies, service providers enable and facilitate that corruption. So for me, having been involved in the struggle to end apartheid in South Africa, having had the extraordinary privilege of serving under someone like Nelson Mandela, and experiencing 4 years where everything that we did as a newly elected democratic government was in the national interest, and then seeing that unravel so quickly, having worked in the City of London in the financial sector, it's a question I ask myself all the time. What has happened to our ethics and values? Why do we not get up every morning to say, today I'm going to lead a good life and I'm going to contribute to my community, my society, and to the world in which I live?
I think it's a very valid point. And to just push back a little bit, because, my background is religious philosophy, but also very much in the world of psychology. And the answer to that question is, it's not real unless it's real to me. Not me personally, but to the individual. And what I mean by that is, corruption is something that happens over there, in that country, or in that echelon, but not in my world. And so we are somehow distanced from it, and it doesn't seem real. And I think we've become it's really interesting that in the social media world, we're exposed more than ever, which has actually made us more and more insulated. We've become more and more like, I don't want to, it's tinfoil hat stuff. It's, it's conspiracy theory. It's not really happening. And so I think that that's part of the thing. It becomes self-preservation. What's your thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, social media has all sorts of advantages.
Yes.
One of its profound disadvantages, in my opinion, is that there is such a surfeit of information, and it is sometimes difficult to actually be able to decide what of this information is factual, is meaningful, what of it is just nonsense. And so I think people who do the sort of work that myself and others around the world do, investigative research, we have a real responsibility to ensure that everything we write about, we talk about, we make films about, is based on fact. So when I wrote The Shadow World, which was my second book, there hadn't been a book published on the global arms trade since 1979. And the first edition, and the first edition of The Shadow World came out at the end of 2011. So, I mean, we're talking about a period of over 30 years. And the reason for that is it's an incredibly secretive trade,
Yes.
covered by national security secrecy, as you can understand. The people involved in the trade, politicians, political parties, executives of defense companies, various types of intermediaries, military leaders, etc., can be quite litigious. So publishers were very wary of publishing in this very controversial area. So what I decided to do is I decided to write something of a hybrid book, a book that was both accessible to an ordinary reader, but where every statement about some sort of wrongdoing or the consequences of an arms deal was grounded in fact. So a book of 555 pages has almost 3,000 footnotes.
Wow.
So if you read something in the book, you then turn to the footnotes to look at the documents that that statement is based on.
Yes.
Now, obviously, we can't do this on social media.
No.
But I think the responsibility is the same. But what it does do is for the audience of that social media, it makes it incredibly difficult to differentiate. And here, to be honest with you, Dov, I think one of the reasons we don't hear enough about corruption, about the arms trade and its consequences, is because the traditional media have failed us.
Yeah, so that's the other side of it, right? Because we are living in this fire hose of social media information, very difficult to filter through it and work out what's real, what's not real. Oftentimes, the fraudulent is presented as the fact, and the fact is presented as the fraudulent, as you and I were talking about before we even came on. And so it becomes difficult for a person who says, listen, I'm not a journalist. I don't have time to sit around for 10 hours and work out what is what. And so, you know, we rely on News at 10. We rely on, you know, the BBC. We rely on CNN. Places that used to be very stable. So, I mean, you know, when I was a kid, I've been interested in politics since I was 10. So that's, you know, years. And, you know, I would watch News at 10 and trusted that that was the news. When CNN started, I trusted that that was news. Now I do listen to the BBC, but I even CNN, but I also listen to Fox, and I also listen to Al Jazeera, RT. You know, I go through as many of them as I possibly can, left and right, even Breitbart. I go through them left and right because I'm trying to find, but that's me. That's my hunger. That's my curiosity. And that's where I feel like, as you said, general journalism, like it's, do you remember John, what was his name? Pillinger.
Right? John Pilger.
Pilger, yes, Pilger.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, John Pilger was brilliant. Aussie, living in England, really like would go after things. He was he was the personification for me of journalism. And where are the Johns now?
Yeah.
Like, I don't see that, not in the general news.
I think part of the problem is that the media has obviously, like most aspects of our lives, become very commercialized.
Yes.
And these sorts of investigations can take years and years. I spent 7.5 years researching and writing The Shadow World.
Wow.
And news organizations today cannot invest that amount of time in these sorts of stories, as a consequence of which they become ever more reliant on outside organizations. But it's not only that aspect of it, which for economic reasons I can partly understand.
Yeah.
It's also the reality that they're desperate to avoid controversy. So unfortunately, you have a situation where somebody like a President Donald Trump gets elected, or a Boris Johnson gets elected Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Or Bolsonaro or Rodrigo in Philippines.
Absolutely. And, you know, the reality is, my opinion is, and of course others would have different opinions, which I accept, but my opinion is that a lot of what comes out of the mouths of those leaders we've mentioned tends not to have much of a relationship with the truth or with fact.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that in order to try to appear balanced, a lot of the mainstream media, including the BBC, including CNN and other big broadcasters, they won't simply say, well, actually, that's not true, this isn't true, and that isn't true. And I think this is a very worrying development, because not only has it shifted the entire discourse completely to the right, because you now have what I would describe as far-right leaders who are espousing sometimes racist views,
yes,
who are espousing views that are incredibly discriminatory against people on the basis of all sorts of personal factors. But they're saying this is an opinion and here's another opinion, rather than saying, well, actually, what was presented as fact doesn't bear scrutiny as fact. And I think this is where that gap has come. And I've found it's manifested in my work in the following way. I've appeared on various broadcast media for decades now.
yes,
And since I was a member of parliament in South Africa. And more recently, so over the last, let's say 6 or 7 years or so, there have been literally dozens of examples where I'm asked to go onto a program, and as I'm about to sit down for the interview, and this is obviously before lockdown, the producer would whisper in my ear, oh, just remember, don't say anything bad about this country or that individual or this particular incident. And it got to the point where it really annoyed me. So a case in point, talking about the arms industry, one of the countries that comes up a great deal is obviously Saudi Arabia, which plays a crucial role in the industry, which is involved in a brutal, murderous conflict in Yemen, and which buys tens of billions of dollars of weaponry from the US, from Canada, from the UK, from Europe, et cetera, all the time. This is a deeply authoritarian regime where not only haven't women been allowed to drive, they've had the guardianship system. Women who protested the driving ban were actually arrested, some of whom are still in jail today. This is a regime that has financed and supported what our governments describe as extremist Islamists, the very people we've been engaged in a sort of endless war on terror against. But we continue to sell them tens of billions of dollars of weaponry, and then we're shocked when that same weaponry from the US or the UK lands up in the hands of some of these extremist groups. And it is probably the most corrupt country on the planet, and its arms deals are quite literally, as I show in the book and the film, a way of moving money from the fiscus into private offshore accounts of senior members of the royal family around the world. And the number of times, as I'm about to go on air to talk about the global arms trade, the producer has whispered into my ears, oh, and don't say anything about Saudi Arabia. And in some places, the broadcaster, which might be state-owned, and the government has a volatile and changing relationship with Saudi Arabia, I'll go in on one occasion and they'll say to me, say what you want about Saudi Arabia. And on another occasion, they'll say to me, don't mention Saudi Arabia in this interview. And I find that unacceptable. So my usual response to that is, if I get an instruction like that, is in the first few questions, regardless of what the question is, I'll make sure to insinuate Saudi Arabia and its role in the global arms trade into the answer. But the fact that this is happening, that there's almost a form of self-censorship that is taking place across the mainstream media.
I think you're being kind, though. Andrew, honestly, I think you're being generous in assuming that it's a self-censorship. What about its corruption? What about its the money that is being pumped into those? I mean, you know, when we look at, let's just step back for a minute and look at the US. Okay. You know, anybody on the left was not a fan of Donald Trump. Okay. So, you know, whether you were mildly left or you were extreme left, you weren't a fan of Donald Trump. But, you know, the top guy at CNN was found to freely admit to some chick he was with that he was creating propaganda against Trump. Now, that's not journalism. That's bias,
Yeah.
right? And I wasn't a fan of Trump, but I am a fan of neutral journalism, and you can't criticize Fox if you're doing the same thing on the other side. So it's like, and then you've got the money involved, and the money involved is like they pay the bills, so we can't say this. This is the BBC. We're owned by, it's a state TV station. We have a fragile relationship with Saudi Arabia. They buy a lot of arms from us. We want to keep that money in our GDP. So you know what? Let's let the prince off with a bit of murder. Let's cut some journalists up in it. We'll just let that go. Meanwhile, Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide. All these this. So for me, it's. I think you're generous when you say they're self-censoring. I think there's also a lot of money and corruption that's going on even at those levels.
I agree.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
To be at the upper reaches of the media in any of the countries we're talking about, you're earning a fair amount of money.
Yep.
And you don't want to alienate those who continue to pay that money, be it private corporations, be it the government, et cetera, et cetera. That's not a journalist.
Mm-mm.
Then you are operating as the public relations arm of whoever owns your broadcaster, or, as you mentioned, you're acting as a propagandist.
Yep.
And neither of those functions have great value or utility in terms of news, as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, there is no doubt that there is an element of corruption to it. But what I would describe it as is systemic corruption.
Yes.
Because I think the greatest problem that we face in the world today is the way in which, since the late 1970s, early 1980s, the advent of what has become known as neoliberalism,
mm-hmm.
money and politics, business and politics, the market and politics have become completely intertwined. And I experienced this at first hand in South Africa. And I think that has happened in a way that is both incredibly detrimental to the way we're governed, to the competence, the integrity and honesty of our governments. And I think it's of huge detriment to the private sector and the functioning of any sort of market menchism.
So talk to us about that, because you have a background in economics too. So talk to us about that for a minute, because, on the surface of it, this is all greatly advantageous to the corporate lobbyists who are pulling the strings of politicians, who are pulling the strings of the media. It seems like it's very much in their favor. Neoliberalism is incredibly corrupt. And I'm a capitalist. I'm a capitalist, but not that capitalist, right?
Yeah.
So talk to us about the detriment to them, because that's hard to see when you're scooping in the millions or the billions.
Well, I mean, at the moment, the most privileged legal personas on this planet are corporate entities.
Yes.
There was a study done a few years ago about the scale of government benefits given to corporate entities in the United States and the United Kingdom. And it is exponentially in excess of any sort of benefits that are given to ordinary citizens who might be struggling to pay their way in whatever way it might be, struggling to feed their families, struggling with some form of disability of some sort, requiring some sort of social benefit. It is exponentially greater. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it develops a particular worldview. And that's why this relationship between the corporations and the media is so damaging. So what I see in the world of fighting corruption is that the vast, vast majority of big corporations that I come across in many, many sectors are deeply corrupt. They pay bribes. And that's what I mean by corruption here. They pay bribes.
Yep.
But they regard it simply as a cost of doing business.
Yep.
What then happens is the media very seldom reports on their legal malfeasance. Very, very seldom that you have a full revelation. I mean, there's one example, and I'm not going to mention names here, but you know, you and your listeners will be able to figure this out. There is a massive global bank that has been investigated and fined huge amounts of money for financing gun running, for financing drug cartels,
Yes,
for defrauding literally hundreds of thousands of their own customers.
Yep.
But
no idea what you're talking about.
yeah, exactly. But they still have a banking license. They're still able to practice business, and they make provision in their accounts for these constant fines that they're going to be paying. Now, my opinion is, as an investigative researcher, as somebody who has served on this financial side of government, of the private sector, in the financial sector, and in the so-called third sector, okay? It is my opinion that that particular institution is an organized criminal network. And it is absolutely scandalous that it should be allowed to continue to practice business. So the entire system that we have at the moment favors large corporations. And unfortunately, I am not of the view that corporations have this God-given right to exist. I believe that any institution that exists in our society should be allowed to exist because it contributes positively to our society. And obviously, especially large corporations create a lot of employment, they generate a lot of money in the economy, et cetera, all of the things that we know about business. But if at the end of the day, they're doing more damage than harm, they're paying appallingly bad wages, they're not providing their staff with basic health care, they are conducting criminal activity in order to sell their products or services, or they're enabling or facilitating criminal activity, they and their senior leaders should be punished in exactly the same way as the rest of us are punished when we break the law. So the situation is that we have some people who have sat in jail for decades because
carrying
there was
a joint.
Exactly. Okay. Or, you know, a woman who stole 2 loaves of bread because she had 3 starving children at home and literally couldn't afford to feed them. And she goes to jail for longer than the head of a corporation that is responsible for tens of thousands of deaths of innocent civilians, that is responsible for putting products into the marketplace that are actually deadly. And I'm not just talking about arms here. This could be pharmaceuticals, it could be alcohol, it could be all sorts of things. And even when there are the occasional cases where the corporation is brought to book in some way, the worst that ever happens is that a fine is levied. And in the worst case scenarios, an already retired executive will get a suspended sentence and be told that he or she can no longer serve on any board. And because they're probably in their late 70s or early 80s, that's not going to change their life trajectory in any way whatsoever. The actual executives who are running the corporation and responsible for the malfeasance at the time continue to receive their bonuses, continue to lead extraordinary lives. So that the world is literally divided into what the brilliant sociologist David Graeber, who very sadly passed away far too young just a few months ago, what he described as the 1%.
Yeah.
And, you know, I come from a country that has amongst the highest inequality in the world, in South Africa. And I think that one of the manifestations of this sort of focus on the corporations is that inequality has so skyrocketed in our societies. And there are literally dozens and dozens of excellent academic studies that show that inequality is absolutely dreadful for the healthcare of a nation, is absolutely dreadful for the general well-being of a population. And so I think the sort of advantageous position that corporations find themselves in, and this virtual legal impunity with which they operate, actually has devastating consequences for the vast majority of the population on a day-to-day basis.
But it's not bad for the corporate. I mean, like, so you made a statement that it's bad for the corporate, but it again in the short view, there's nothing bad about it for them. It's all good for them. So you know, like I work with CEOs and leaders of that kind, and I'm trying to say this is not good for your business in the long term, but it's hard to get them to see a long term when the short term is so sweet.
That is the problem. And we have become so short-termist.
Yes.
All that executives look at are the next quarterly results.
Yeah.
I don't believe that's the way to run a business. And I'm not the only person who says that. Even Warren Buffett has that view. And he's a hell of a
even
lot
China has that view.
Well,
Whether we agree with China or not, they're making a 100-year plan. They're not making the next quarter.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's another dimension in which it harms you. It's like the situation you have to ask yourself, and give me a moment here, because this might not be instinctively sensible. But I would argue that apartheid in South Africa was not only absolutely appalling for Black South Africans, to use the nomenclature of the regime, it was appalling for all South Africans. Because even growing up as a privileged white South African who had a great life in the sun, you would get a job regardless of your competence, your willingness to work, depending on the color of your skin.
Yeah.
That doesn't make for a psychologically healthy life.
No.
Because you are also believing things that, if you actually thought about for a moment, were very difficult to sustain. That I, as a person, because of the pale color of my skin, am superior to all of those people because they have a darker skin. I, therefore, can do what I want with and to that person. Now, as you would know, my first training, interestingly, my first degrees were in clinical psychology. I, because of my age, as a white male South African, the only way to avoid serving in the apartheid military was to study endlessly. So my first 3 degrees were in clinical psychology. And you cannot live a healthy existence when your existence is based on some profoundly unjust, unsustainable things. And that is the way in which, even for the very senior corporate executives leading large corporations who are making extreme amounts of money, if they're totally honest with themselves, can they live with themselves? Because ultimately they can't take the money with them. And the end game for all of us is the same, whatever one's spiritual or religious beliefs. And for me, the most important thing, and I've had to ask myself this question at key moments, certainly in my political career, the most important thing for me is, when I'm on my deathbed, to be able to say to myself, did I lead a generally good life? Did I, in some tiny way, make the world a very slightly better place than it was when I came into it? And from my perspective, as somebody who's earned a lot of money as a banker, as somebody who's earned less than no money as a political activist for many years of my life, and as somebody who now earns sort of somewhere in between those two things, doing the work I'm very fortunate to do, my only objective is that I want to be able to face myself.
And I think it's a very good point, and it's where we have to end this section of the show. But I want to challenge it by saying that the presumption is the fault there, and the presumption is that Others have that moral fiber that they would ask that question, and oftentimes people don't. As you said, we are short-term thinkers, short-term gain focused. We are working out of a psychological, what I call the precious lie. We're all carrying our own precious lies, and you have examined. Examined corruption in the world through global arms, and I investigated and spent a lot of time, even spoke about it in the late 80s, about the corruption that was going on in the world, whether it was with the world banks and all these different things. And particularly in Africa, there was a lot of that stuff going on. Now it's going on with China. And people would ask me all the time, how much money do they need? And I said, there's your problem. And they go, what? And I said, you think it's about money. It's not about money, it's about power. And so that level of deeply psychotic, narcissistic behavior, it's a psychosis and it's a narcissism level that doesn't have that moral question of, oh, did I live a decent life? It's, did I gather enough power and money, right, to pass on to those who carrying my seed, because they are an extension of me. Because a narcissist doesn't have children, they have appendages, they have extensions of themselves. Ivanka Trump is not Donald Trump's daughter, she's an appendage of Donald Trump that he fancies. So it's all this extension of, and I think that's part of the presumption. We got to take a break. We got to come back for part 2 of the show. We're here with the fabulous Andrew Feinstein, and he's doing amazing work. He has written a best-selling book that's been made into an award-winning movie. There's lots more you can find out about him. We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back in just a click. But before we do, I just want to ask Andrew to tell us where you, dear listener, can find out more about him and his fabulous work.
The best place to look at the work we do is on our website, shadowworldinvestigations.org, or simply search my name, Andrew Feinstein, on all the usual social media where I'm very active.
Fabulous. And we'll be back with you in one click. So remember, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious. We'll be back in one click.